and it's broken down into percentages over different categories. But basically, I'll have to apply it to the BSRB and give them like different paperwork, and which includes like a transcript of my grades, review letters from 3 people I know who can comment on my psychological work, and all this other technical red tape and stuff. But I'll have to apply to them and then take the EPPP and pass with a 60% overall score in order to get licensed. And from what I know, it's going to be changing from the DSM-4 material to the DSM-5 material. I think, I'll have to check the date, but it's going to be like midsummer or something. So if I don't take it soon enough, I'll have to study and learn the DSM-5, and that'll be all wonderful and fun. And it's really expensive too, because like the study materials are a couple $100, which you'll want, because you're going to need methodological material to cover, because I would not want to try to go through textbooks to try to guess and try to figure out the study materials yourself. And then to actually just pay to take the exam is another several $100. I don't even know how much, but it's expensive. It's ridiculous. And
yeah, it's a game. It's the regulatory boards become a monster in and of themselves that we have to feed every year, every 2 years, depending on your licensing. We don't want to discourage people, but it'll be the same, not as probably as intense at like a social work. I do the same thing. I had to do it took me 3 hours to do the test. I had to pay them a fee to do the test. They did have study stuff you could study. And the idea about the study stuff is just, it sort of gives you an idea of what the test creators are going to ask you. It doesn't give you the answers, but you know, when you're going to take a test, you want to know what is in the mind of the test maker, because that's what's going to get you through. Because like in social work, you have to answer politically correct as well as the truth. So you try to figure that one out. But you know what answer they want, so you put it down there, even if you don't necessarily agree with all of it. Some of it's pretty cut and dry, but there's always stuff that you may or may not agree with. Or what I did was I would mess around in my head and think, well, in this circumstance, I would do that. But in this other circumstance, no, you want to know what, in general, they want you to say. Because they don't want you to take circumstances in a test, you can't really do that. They wanted to. So yeah, that's what helped me more than anything, is just being able to know what was on there. Okay, what is he doing? Did you do any self-assessment in your school? Did they ask you to do any like psychotherapy or?
Oh no, that wasn't a requirement.
Okay, they didn't say, okay, Richard,
go see a therapist.
Yeah, well, see, some schools I know everybody does that. You know, there's at least some, and we do that here just in the classroom where we ask you to use what you've learned to look at yourself and to think about it and write a journal entry, and you don't have to write everything on there you think, but because people should probably do that, at least have. Did they talk about that in your schoolwork, that sometimes therapists need therapists to deal with it?
A little bit in schoolwork. It came up more with my internship, because I had a direct primary supervisor, and that kind of came up. Because for me, with my internship, one of the main things that came up was interpersonal skills, because that's basically your bread and butter with psychology, and that was something that was kind of a big learning process for me. Was like in undergrad, I had this mentality where, you know, developing rapport and that kind of relation you develop is like 70% or more of the therapeutic process. But I had this kind of ABC mentality where it's like, okay, you meet the person, you go through the intake, you get all their history, you explain confidentiality and all that legal stuff. And then you kind of develop that trusting relationship, you get to know each other, and then you kind of switch gears and you bring up all this technical knowledge, you know, and you do this wondrous thing called therapy. And like it just completely changes. That's how I always thought of it. But from what I'm understanding, it's more of, it's always going to be part of that relationship, and that's always going to be a part of it. And you may, as you get in there, you might have them do kind of homework and bring up some different life skills and things they can kind of bring up and do, but it really is about just active listening and being there with them.
Carl Rogers. And it's more of a, if you think of it, if you know anything about research, you mentioned quantitative and qualitative.
Mhm.
The relationship is qualitative. How do we interact with one another that will, and there's something about, I always tell people from a Christian standpoint, to me it's actual love. It's loving that person in an appropriate way, but having real Carl Rogers' idea of having that positive regard for the other person. And people can, there's something about that when you have it that changes, that people can change within. They don't have to, but it gives them a better chance to make different choices because they know you really do believe in them. You really do support them as a human being. And that could be anybody from my guy in my prison that thought he was God and was going to kill everybody when he decided to remake the world. But if I could actually show him that I cared about him, I gave him a better chance of whether he killed a guard today, whether he decided it was time to remake the world and I take a guard out while I do it. So it was more of every situation is going to have that element in it. But I think that what you just said was just the positive regard and relationship is the key. And even if that may not be your forte, you may want to do testing. Even with testing, you have to. If you come in there and you look like some guy sitting behind a desk in a suit who doesn't care about you, it's gonna affect you. It's gonna affect how you do the tests. You're gonna be distracted by the tests or whatever, distracted by the person's demeanor. So that's really.
That can get you more anxious pretty quick.
Right.
You feel like they're really stern and going to kind of grill you. It's like, put it really on the spot versus if they're a little more calm and relaxed.
Matter of fact, and here's what you do, and you do this, when you're done, this is what's going to happen. So you give them more of a sense of how you'd want to be treated in that situation. So it's the old, it's Jesus's rule, love them like you want to be treated, treat them like you want to be treated. Did you come up with a question?
Yeah. Do you ever think that you should have done something else, like picked a different major or something different with psychology?
I did, yeah. Especially at the beginning of the internship and at certain points where it was really hard or I was really anxious. It's kind of like, did I make the right choice? Am I suited for this? Yeah, it definitely came up. I think two things that helped was, like at the end of the day, just being able to set it aside and bring yourself back down and calm. But I think in a more bigger picture, it's kind of nice thinking about psychology in general is what you just kind of mentioning is, maybe working with people in a therapeutic sense isn't your forte, isn't what you're really good at, isn't what you feel comfortable with. But I think psychology is broad enough where you don't have to throw it all away and start from scratch. You may think, well, maybe I can go more testing route so that there's less of that intensity and it's more like, okay, I can be calm, I can be relaxed, I can come in here for an hour or two, do some testing and, that's it. And then I can just do technical, grading it, scoring it, and write up a report. Or what you were saying is kind of that IO route where completely different, where you may kind of do some interviews and interactions with a couple of people, but you're looking at the business, you're not looking at a dysfunctional business as opposed to a dysfunctional person.
And there's variations of all that. There's cultural psychology, there's community psychology, all kinds of things where you could be involved, like in building bridges as a community psychologist, from a community psychology perspective. How do communities, what's the psychology of this particular community? Because it's an organism, right? If you can think of it that way. It's got lots of different individuals with lots of different agendas. And how do you help that organism to be healthier? And you could diagnose it, or you could help from a positive psychology. How could we grow beyond? Maybe it's doing great, but there's changes on the horizon. Like there's going to be not enough technical people in the world to fill all the jobs because the school system has dropped so many. We don't have enough people to replace all the baby boomers. So even something that's functioning really well now is not necessarily going to function well in the near future unless, and this is happening in Europe already, where they pay people to have extra children. because there's not enough children being born, because we bought into the population problem, as if there was an overpopulation problem. And actually, there's not enough people to cover all the bases now, especially technical. They got to take the right stuff in school. They can't just skip science, right? Like I did. But that's the good thing about psychology is you can move within any of that. You don't, even if you skip science in school, you can still be very effective. So I went to graduate school in social work, and I would say I was more psychology oriented, clinically oriented, because I was a drug and alcohol counselor. But it was a totally shock to go and to walk into that. I don't know why I can't see things coming, but it seems like I'm in the middle of it. I go, what was I thinking? But then I regroup, like you said, regroup and see, well, how does this work? I really believe I was led to do what I was supposed to do. Just sometimes I think God said, I'm going to have to blindfold him to walk him into this. But it worked out. It's all worked out really well. Any other questions?
I have a question. Looking back, from your undergraduate career, what would you have done to be more prepared for graduate school?
What would I have done ahead of time? That's a good question. Doesn't really apply to graduate school so much, but one of the things that's been helpful, would have been more helpful for my internship and kind of going for a job now, would really getting more familiar with diagnoses, excuse me. Like the DSM, I guess it'll be 5 now, which you're right in the middle of that transition along with me, so that'll be fun. But you don't need to memorize it. You don't need to know off the top of your head every single diagnosis possibility and all the different
Symptoms or
criteria. But it's really good to have a working knowledge. And so, for example, like, let's just say major depressive disorder, just knowing how long does it take to really meet that criteria, and then maybe some of the basic symptoms. You don't have to memorize all 12 possibilities, but having 3 or 4 big ones just offhand would be really handy. Wasn't really grilled through in graduate school, but definitely at this, going through the internship and work, would have been a lot handier. But honestly, there's really not a huge difference per se. Well, there is, but there isn't. I guess what I mean is kind of what you do doesn't change, but the expectations for your professional work, well, a little bit higher. They won't tolerate being late or skipping class. You don't want to toy around with that kind of idea. I didn't mess around with it, but that's certainly something you don't want to expect is leniency. I actually have a decent little story about that because there was a paper I turned in. I mentioned earlier there was that assignment that kind of built on top of itself. And it's only like the second part of it. But when I turned it in, I didn't turn in the first part with the second. And I got a pretty significant grade doc for that. And I had talked to the professor specifically when I was asking what I needed to do, and they didn't mention that. But I still got a pretty significant doc, and then I talked to them, and I was able to get that point back. But that's just an example of how they'll expect you to really bring up your game and just do things without really explicitly hammering into your head. So that makes sense.
Yeah, doing it with excellence and doing what you know is the top.
Yeah, doing it
The
right
best.
the first time, and
Yeah.
not like, oh, this is a 20-page paper due next week. I'll turn in 5 pages and kind of plead my case. Probably not a good idea.
All right, well, I think chapel's coming up. Let's give your appreciation for coming here today. And